Nancy Cott. I'm the director of the Schlesinger Library. We are all at the library very happy to be hosting this event. This is, as I'm sure you've all been reminded if you've been listening to the radio at all lately, this is a year of many 50ths, and especially as we move toward November 22nd, it's impossible not to be reminded of the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination. But we have a happier 50th to mark today, and the Schlesinger Library is really welcomed and concerned to mark the 50th anniversary of the feminine mystique, because we are the repository of Betty Friedan's papers. And that the Schlesinger Library acquired the papers of Betty Friedan in 1971 is really an attestation to the insight and the intrepidness of the very tiny library staff at that time. Also, the National Organization for Women, of which Friedan was president from 1966, the year of its founding, to 1970, designated the Schlesinger Library its repository in that same year, 1971. And we've been collecting those records of Now ever since. For the past several years, we've also captured the Now website, as we have also captured the websites of numerous ongoing women's organizations whose records we hold. And the Friedan papers and the Now papers form the nucleus of the very wonderfully rich collection of materials from the women's movement of the 60s and 70s. Betty Friedan's feminine mystique, with its now famous opening line, "The problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women," was published in February 1963. It went into a paperback edition the next year and became the best-selling nonfiction book of 1964. By naming the problem that has no name, the book was a catalyst for many women's awakening to a critical and a collective stance on their lives. Friedan, who was a wife and mother and journalist herself at the time, trained in psychology, raked through the strategies of social science, journalism, psychoanalysis, and marketing to show what they had amassed in the post-World War II years and to contend that they had coalesced to convince middle-class women that their destiny and their route to happiness lay in cultivating their own essential femininity, of which domesticity, wifehood, and motherhood should be the obvious consequences. Yet, happiness had not resulted. And Friedan instead looked to non-domestic and self-expressive employments for women as the better route. Friedan's book was immensely controversial as well as popular at the time, and ever since has repeatedly been both championed for its path-breaking insights and sharply criticized for its limitations. Today, rather than focusing only on the book, our two speakers will also discuss contemporary discourses about women, men, the home, and work. The question of work-family balance has been posed ever since Friedan's book as a women's problem. Should it be? I'm delighted today to have here Stephanie Coontz, whose most recent book, called A Strange Stirring, The Feminine Mystique and American Women at the Dawn of the 60s, explored the impact of Friedan's book at the time. She is the well-known author of several books setting the record straight on the history of family life in the United States, including The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap, and The Way We Really Are, Coming to Terms with America's Changing Families. She is deservingly widely admired for her indefatigable efforts to bring the findings and insights of social history and feminist historians into public discussion, by testifying to Congress, appearing on radio and TV, and having her work featured there, writing op-eds, most recently as a guest columnist for the New York Times, and helping and encouraging others to write op-eds. She pursues many of these efforts in connection with her role as Director of Research and Public Education at the Council on Contemporary Families, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization of scholars in various disciplines who all work on the family in one way or another and have gotten together to provide accurate information on trends and best practices for the media, for policymakers, and the public in general. We're equally fortunate to be able to hear Ariela Dubler's entry into these public questions as a new voice. With a PhD in history and a law degree, she teaches constitutional law, family law, and legal history at Columbia Law School, and has focused her writings on the law's contributions and constrictions in changing norms of sexual morality and marriage during the 20th century. She will soon publish a book to be called The Parental Difficulty, which addresses the shaping force of the law in our understandings of mothers' and fathers' roles at home and at work. She forecast a leading theme of her forthcoming book in an op-ed in the LA Times just before the 2012 election, in which she was critiquing Mitt Romney's attempt to attract women voters by stating his support for flex time at work. She wrote there that Romney was regrettably repeating a message too likely to be sent to women already. Work-family balance is your struggle alone, which was also, she said, an unspoken message to men. It's not your problem. Each of our panelists will speak for a brief time, and then I intend to ask them both a couple of questions so they can extend their thoughts a bit more informally, after which we will open the floor to questions.
It's very interesting to talk about the feminine mystique in today's world 50 years later. For many young people, 1963 might as well be 1369, you know. It is such an entirely different world. And in fact, one way to sum up what a different world it was that a couple of years before the book came out, Friedan published the first excerpt from that book in Good Housekeeping magazine. And the title, it seems to me to sum up just how far we've come. Now, I should say a few words about titles. I write a lot of op-eds, as Nancy said. You don't get to choose your headlines. You know, they choose what seems the most controversial. Seriously, can't tell you how many times I've opened up a newspaper, seen the headline, thought, what maniac wrote that, and then seen my byline underneath it. So, what did they have? How did they title Friedan's work to make it so attention-grabbing? It started with the words, I say, and you know that's a signal that we give when we're going to say something really controversial. I say, women are people too. You know, but it's really important to understand what a radical thing that was to say back in 1963, at a time when Marnia Farnham, one of the most publicized and reprinted psychiatrists of the era, who wrote a book with Ferdinand Lundberg called The Lost Sex, and who wrote for all these women's magazines, said actually the worst mistake, this is a quote, society can make is to treat its citizens primarily as people rather than primarily as male and female. So what did it mean to treat them primarily as male or female? Well, as a 1970 book, children's book that I still have a copy of on my shelves, put it, its title was, I'm glad I'm a girl, I'm glad I'm a boy. Boys invent things. Girls use what boys invent. Boys can eat, girls can cook. And it went on from there, downhill from there. In adulthood, even more elaborate theories that women were naturally dependent, even had a little bit of masochism, which was natural and healthy for them, unlike men. And as Helene Deutsch, one of a long line of women who've made a career out of telling other women not to have careers, put it, the normal woman, she said, renounces all aspirations of her own, not out of coercion, like in the bad old days, but because she understands her greatest fulfillment will come from her role as a wife and a mother. And anyone who aspired to more was sick. Not just in theory, but in practice. Society treated its citizens as male or female. If you were a girl then, you couldn't even raise or lower the flag at the beginning of the school day. That was a job reserved for boys. If you graduated from school and wanted to go to work, you had to turn to the help wanted female section, where the wages were legally paid less, and where the advertisers could ask for perky, attractive, well-groomed, and in fact, one ad that I read of the time, must be very attractive. Sexual harassment was a tremendous problem, but there wasn't even a name for it. And one of the things that is stunning is a lot of people who believe that homemakers at least were better off before feminists came and devalued them. Well, it turns out that they were very devalued before, as Rebecca Jo Plant's lovely book on mom shows. There were only 8 states in the country where women who were homemakers had any claim at all upon the income their husband earned during the course of the marriage. And even in the community property states, the man had rights such as the right to bequeath his share to someone else, which she could not do, or to decide what would be done with it. There were head and master laws. It was the man who was legally determined the residence of a family. So if your husband moved and you wanted to stay in the town, maybe to take care of aging parents, he could actually legally charge you with desertion and win a fault-based divorce. The definition of rape in those days was sexual intercourse with a woman other than the man's wife, because it was considered one of the normal prerogatives of men. And don't even get me into some of the articles, a few articles I read about domestic violence, unless at the reception you'd like to have your hair curl. So we've come a very, very long way. Full gender equality does remain elusive. Women have greatly increased their status in the upper, not quite the top 5%, but just below that, top 20%, very impressively, though not at the very top. They chair less than 3% of America's corporate boards and hold only 16% of the seats. Women now earn more college degrees than men. They have done so for more than 30 years. But at every level of education, the average woman working full-time still earns less than the average man with the same credentials. But that is an important change, because until 1980, the average college-educated woman working full-time made less than the average high school-educated man working full-time. Working-class occupations are nearly as segregated by gender today as they were in 1950, and women remain disproportionately concentrated in low-wage jobs, so that in all age groups and sectors of the population, women are more likely to live in poverty than men. There have been the kinds of implicit bias tests and outright bias tests prove that there are still many, many prejudices against women. And discrimination starts as early as childhood, even at home. In an early rehearsal for the well-known leisure gap between men and women, boys spend an average of 2 fewer hours per week doing chores at home than girls, but get larger allowances. From puberty on, females are judged more harshly than males on the basis of their looks, dress, age, and sexual behavior. In the workplace, behaviors that are seen as admirably assertive on the part of a man are seen as, unacceptably aggressive on the part of a woman. And of course, women remain especially vulnerable to sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and denial of reproductive rights. And in fact, one of the few areas where you've seen some backsliding is the tremendous assault on women's reproductive rights over the last 10 years, mounted not just over controversial issues like abortion, but issues on which all Americans, basically almost all Americans agree, such as access to contraception. But to get to the modern left, this is not your grandfather's patriarchy. We are not living in even your father's privilege. As I said, as late as 1980, the average female college graduate earned less than a high school man. Now she earns more, but not quite as much as a similarly educated credential. But because women earn 60% of all college degrees and a majority of even higher degrees, women in their 20s who are single and don't have kids now earn more than men in their 20s in the same age group in most metropolitan areas. We've seen tremendous improvements in male behavior. Domestic violence rates have plummeted since the 1960s. Sexual assaults, of course, they're far too high, but it's important to recognize and celebrate that they have, since we've been getting accurate statements from victimization surveys, they've fallen by more than 73% since 1973. And over the past 30 years, most states have abandoned their legal enforcement of head and master laws and of patriarchal privilege. No state has dismantled the historic residue of disadvantage that women face, and few have even tried. But the mechanisms through which gender inequality work are now much more circuitous, much more indirect than they used to be. For example, in patriarchal systems where women worked alongside men doing equal work but had no right to the property, or even in the paternalistic era where they gained some rights as women but still were segregated into jobs. So the ways that this inequality has changed, I think, make it necessary in one ironic way to go back to Friedan's book. Friedan's book has been rightly criticized for its denial, its failure to recognize race and class differences and her prejudices toward lesbians and gays. But one of the things she said there that I think is a very important thing to remember at this particular stage in the struggle for equality is that women's liberation is not a zero-sum game. It will result, she said, very controversially, in improvements for men as well. And I think that is so much more true today that we really have to think through its implications. Because if you look at the main sources of gender inequality today, two of them apply to men really as much as they apply to women. The first is the work-family issue. The motherhood, most of the way that one big part of the wage gap between men and women is no longer discriminatory, unequal pay when you're hired just because you're a woman. It's what they call the mother penalty. It's the fact that women still tend to take more responsibility for childbearing and drop out of school, drop out of work. After 1 year, a woman who quits work to raise her kids faces a 20% future salary penalty, and if she stays out 3 or 4 years, it reaches a 40% lifetime salary penalty. So that motherhood penalty is very strong in terms of its economic implications, and it's also very difficult because employers are prejudiced against mothers, and we have many, many studies that show that mothers are assumed to be not interested in work, not good at work, even if they don't ask for work-family accommodations. It's assumed that they will someday, so they are less likely to be hired than childless women, and if they are hired, they're hired at lower salaries and are incidentally held to much higher standards of punctuality than the rest of the workforce. But it's important to recognize that this is really a caregiving penalty, not just a motherhood penalty. The only difference in the way it works for women and for men is that co-workers and employers assume that a woman will, in fact, neglect her work and want to make work-family accommodation, want more flexible work hours, want to take leave, and they penalize her on that assumption. They assume that a man will not. But it now turns out that when a man does ask for leave, he is penalized in very much the same way. Bullied, harassed, prejudices mount against him, and he pays a financial penalty for taking those leaves. So it's important for us to recognize that, as I think the way you wanted us to answer that question, Nancy, it's not just a women's issue and must not be just a women's issue, especially since men now report higher levels of work-family conflict on average than women do, in part because of the victories of the feminist movement in helping them understand that family life should be as open to men and as much a part of men's rights and duties as work life is for women. The second big source of gender inequality today is not, again, discriminatory wages per se, but extreme inequality of wages. The majority of gender inequality is connected to the fact that the U.S. has about the most unequal wage structure in all of the advanced industrial worlds. And women tend to be concentrated in low-wage jobs, partly because of their motherhood experiences, but so now do growing numbers of men. Back in the 1950s and 60s, there was what R.W. Connell has called a patriarchal bonus that working men got, whatever their race, their skill level, their educational level. That bonus has been withdrawn for low-income men. For example, as low-skill jobs have been, as mid-level jobs have been disappearing, more men have fallen down to low-skill jobs instead of raising up to high-skill jobs than is true of women, because women have still been making their way up after starting from a much lower base. Between 1969 and 1994, real wages fell by 2.2% for female high school dropouts and 8% for the youngest female high school dropouts. But the real wages of male high school dropouts fell by more than 18% and by a stunning 27% for the youngest group of men. That kind of difference, more than a quarter of women's catch-up of wages with men has become is because of males' losses in jobs and income. This is not what feminism was all about. It would take a pretty perverse kind of ideal of women's equality to say, oh, this is what we were looking for. So passing family-friendly policies is good for men as well as women. It reduces the gender gap, for example, when you have good child care. It halves the gender gap, but it also makes it more possible for men to be real partners in family life, as so many young men want to do. The same thing is true with raising low wages. It's in the interest of women, it will reduce the gender gap, but it will also come to the defense of the many men who are really also in trouble in this economy. So I'd like to just end by suggesting that one of our big challenges today is to figure out ways where we continue to fight the biases and outright prejudices against women, but without setting ourselves in opposition to our growing number of allies who are also losing ground in this very punishing economy. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Nancy, for putting together this program and for inviting me to be a part of it. It's a pleasure and a real privilege to share the stage with you two. And I want to thank you especially for prompting me to reread The Feminine Mystique, which I first read in Women's Studies 10A here, and I had not reread since then. And I commend it to all of you who have not read it recently, who have never read it. Parts of it read as extremely dated, and other parts read as less dated than one would hope. And I think it's actually challenging to sort out which parts are which, and that's what I've been trying to do as I've pondered the question that Nancy asked us to think about today, which is what's changed at home and at work in the 50 years since the publication of The Feminine Mystique. So the short answer is clearly a lot, and you can just look around this room for the answer right in the quickest terms. Here we all are. I'll date myself and my mother by saying that my mother started at Harvard Law School the year after the publication of The Feminine Mystique and never saw a woman law professor and had no women's bathroom in the main law building. And it is unquestionably the case that we live in radically altered times. The diversity of both our workplaces and of our families would have simply been hard to imagine, I think, 50 years ago. But I think there's a much longer answer to the what's changed question, and that longer answer is also the more interesting one, and the much harder one. So for starters, I'm incredibly struck by the fact that 50 years after the feminine mystique, this country is really collectively still engaged in a very gendered conversation among and about women, about home and work, present company notably accepted. It's all over the op-ed pages. It's all over the bestseller list. It's about moms and work and leaning in and superwomen and why women can't have it all. It's an enormous, which by the way is a title that Anne Marie Slaughter is very clear she did not choose. So I don't think she intended to make it that reductionist, and I think she too was surprised by the title they ran with it. That said, it's a very different conversation than the conversation that Friedan entered, but in the main, it is still dramatically about women. It's still in the feminine. It still assumes, generally, that we don't talk about parents and their roles at home and at work. It's still a conversation in which gender and class crisscross in extremely complicated and often under-discussed ways. And it's still a conversation that largely assumes that work and family is fraught terrain for women who have choices and just a way of life for men. I'll note parenthetically that no one is ever surprised to discover that my husband has 3 kids and a really challenging job. And no one thinks that that nugget would sell magazines. Now, I will say that it is a conversation among and about women that is still taking place at a time when, as Stephanie said, women are still doing more childcare than men and are still underrepresented in many of the top ranks of the work world. So we live in unquestionably a radically altered world, and nonetheless, I don't think the answer to what's changed at home and at work lends itself to any simple teleological story of change. I think it's a confusing time, which is why I'm so excited to be here and to be part of this conversation. So I want to do something slightly different as the law professor on the panel. My goal for this afternoon, in the very short time that I have left, is to convince you that we should look to the law as an important site for thinking about these stories of change and continuity. And in particular, I think we should turn to the law as a window into what I think is a much larger cultural confusion about whether, in fact, mothers and fathers should be treated the same or differently when it comes to home and work. And I think that's a core question that we should ponder in thinking about the legacy of Friedan's work and about the ongoing feminine nature of our usual conversations about home and at work. I should note at the outset that the law is really glaringly absent from most of the feminine mystique. This might be especially glaring to a legal historian. One of the things that struck me the most in rereading The Feminine Mystique is how amazing it is that someone could have tried to give a full account of a feminine mystique in the early 1960s without talking about women's legal inequality. This was not actually all in their heads. And if women were hearing voices, as Friedan describes, they were probably not just the voices of Freud and of tradition. They were the loud, coercive voices of judges and lawmakers enforcing legal rules that both reflected and reinforced a deeply gendered social order. And Stephanie has already alluded to that in her comments. So I want to bring the law back into this whole story, which in some sense means assessing where we are in terms that are pretty different from the terms that Friedan used, and I hope you'll all forgive me for that. Now, I want to bring the law back in, not because I think the law provides any easy answers, but actually because I think the law today is deeply confused about what to make of the differences between mothers and fathers. And what I want to argue is that that confusion reflects and in turn reinforces a much deeper, larger cultural confusion that we should think about when we think of Friedan's legacy. So let me name where I see the locus of that confusion, and it's the age-old question. We all know that in certain ways, men and women, mothers and fathers, are different biologically. Women get pregnant and give birth. Not all women, but only women. Men do not get pregnant and give birth. And I think the big, hard question is the one that has always been the big, hard question. So what? How do we get from there, from that story of biology, to the feminine mystique, or to some story of social roles? What significance, if any, should we attach to men's and women's very different roles in procreation once we're long out of the obstetrician's office or the delivery room? And that so what question, right? Men never get pregnant, so what? Is a question that the law has really had ample opportunity to answer. So taking us way back for a moment, way before Betty Friedan, it used to actually be very easy for judges and lawmakers to answer it because within the law, biology was understood to fully determine social roles and thus men's and women's different rights and responsibilities. The law fully embraced, in the parlance of 19th century women's rights activists, the so-called maternal difficulty. Which is the history of the maternal difficulty is what I'm currently engaged in my research. And it's basically, right, the idea is that women's biology, their destiny as mothers actually rendered them incapable of full participation in the public sphere and thus rendered them unsuited to full legal rights. Now, skipping quickly across time, which sometimes pains historians, but stick with me. By the time the Feminine Mystique is published, the legal power of this strongly determinist account of the maternal difficulty was really on the brink of collapse. The biology as destiny story, as Friedan notes, really began to crumble, and it began to crumble across legal areas also, which is why the law is a great place to look to get the basic story of change since the publication of The Feminine Mystique, right? As Stephanie began to talk about, it's really almost impossible to list all of the legal changes that are relevant to thinking about the story of change since the feminist mystique, right? It's about to be the 50th anniversary of Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Roe v. Wade, no-fault divorce, changes in marriage law, an entire body of constitutional sex discrimination law directed at policing the line between real biological differences and outmoded stereotypes. That's the legal architecture for the radically altered world that we all live in. But even in this radically altered world, that so what question remains a puzzle. So what if men and women play different roles in making babies? How is that relevant or irrelevant to their legal rights and their social status? And I think there are many places within the law where we could look to see how confusing that most basic question still is. I'll give you just sort of one place to think about the ongoing confusion as representing the larger confusion that I think we're still engaged in. So just consider this. Since 2001, in constitutional cases, the Supreme Court has twice addressed the question of whether some old-fashioned account of the maternal difficulty, that is some inherent link between the biology of procreation and social roles as parents, whether that kind of story can justify granting men and women different legal rights. And here's the puzzle. Once, the Supreme Court decisively said, no, the law cannot treat mothers and fathers differently with respect to their roles at home and at work just because mothers give birth and fathers don't. The other time, right, again, this is just since 2001. The other time, the Supreme Court decisively said, yes, mothers and fathers can be given different legal rights because the law can presume that because of their different roles in procreation, they will play different roles as parents going forward, right? So my point is that our constitutional law is deeply confused. Now, these are complicated cases, and I'm just going to quickly, without getting too technical, just say a little bit about each of them so that you have a sense of the range of places where the law addresses this state of confusion. So first, think about a case called Nevada Department of Human Resources against Hibbs. In that case, the Supreme Court was asked to decide whether Congress had the power to pass the Family Medical Leave Act, which has gender-neutral leave provisions that Congress applied against the states. And the court was asked to decide whether Congress had the power to do this. And it answered that it did have the power to do this because it said Congress has the power to pass legislation to counter state-enacted forms of sex discrimination. And the Family Medical Leave Act was just such a statute. So the court had to look to state laws and tell a story about something states had done that was a problem under its sex equality norms. And according to the Supreme Court, the problem was state maternity leave laws that gave leave to only mothers and not fathers, and thus presumed that mothers would primarily be caretakers, and that fathers would primarily not be caretakers, right? And those set of assumptions about the primacy of work in fathers' lives and the primacy of caretaking in mothers' lives made by states was sufficient, according to the Supreme Court in Hibbs, to mean that Congress could legislate under the Family Medical Leave Act to give gender-neutral leave. I hope that wasn't too quick, a complicated journey. Right, essentially what the Supreme Court said is you cannot extrapolate from who gives birth to who is going to see work as primary and who is going to see caregiving as primary. Right, so this seems to be a kind of decisive repudiation of what I'm calling the maternal difficulty. But not so fast. This is why I really want to tell a story about confusion. Because alongside Hibbs is another case that's still good Supreme Court law called Nguyen against INS. The historians in the room, Linda Kerber, has been writing about this case for some time. It's a very different type of case. It involves an obscure federal citizenship law that says that if you are the child born abroad to parents, one of whom is a citizen and one of whom is not a citizen, whether you're automatically a citizen depends on whether the citizen parent is your mother or your father. So if you're born abroad to unmarried parents, those are the key, right? We could talk about this for a long time, but if you're born abroad to unmarried parents, one of whom is a citizen and one of whom is not, if your mother is the citizen, you're automatically a citizen, and if your father is the citizen, you are not automatically a citizen, and this is challenged as sex discrimination. On its face, it differentiates between men and women, goes up to the Supreme Court, enter the maternal difficulty. The Supreme Court upholds this law. It says this law is perfectly constitutional. So why is it constitutional to treat these different categories of children and their parents differently? Essentially, the answer is because mothers give birth and fathers don't, and that is significant not only because that means we always know who a mother is and we don't always know who a father is. It's significant, according to the Supreme Court, because giving birth creates the opportunity for a lifelong bond between mother and child that then translates into a lifelong bond between child and nation, right? So remember, this is a citizenship law. Okay, so these cases live alongside one another, and interestingly, most even law professors don't really think about them as in conflict because we teach them in different classes, they're unrelated to each other, there's no doctrinal conflict between these two cases from a lawyer's perspective. But if we consider them together, consider where they leave us 50 years after the feminine mystique. They essentially leave us in a legal regime in which it is both constitutional and unconstitutional for laws to presume that mothers and fathers' distinct roles in procreation determine their familial roles and work roles long after procreation is over. So, to me, this Supreme Court's confusion is emblematic of a larger cultural confusion. We keep talking about moms at work, and I'm not sure we have a coherent account left of why moms and dads are thought to be so different at home and at work. So, am I okay on time? Okay. So to sort of take it out of the legal realm and think about the larger cultural confusion, consider a recent Pew Research Center report that asked people their views on mothers and fathers working outside of their homes. Okay, so 76% of people asked thought that children were just as well off if their fathers worked outside of their homes. By contrast, only 34% thought that children were just as well off if their mothers worked outside of their homes. Asked slightly differently, 51% said that children are better off if their mother is home and not otherwise employed, while only 8% said that children are better off if their father is home and not employed. Now, I'm a lawyer, not a social scientist, but when you put this kind of survey data together with the kind of studies Stephanie was alluding to about how much more childcare mothers do relative to fathers and how much harder it is for mothers to get ahead at work, I'm left wondering how to explain why 50 years after Friedan, mothers and fathers are so differently positioned at home and at work. What story do we tell to explain this? And that's really my puzzle as I reread Friedan. So I don't have an answer to what story we should tell, but I just want to end with a story from way before Friedan, just to pose our contemporary conundrum in more stark historical terms. So it's a story about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, leader of the suffrage movement way before Friedan, who was scheduled to give a lecture in 1858 right here in Boston to a very prominent group of intellectuals. And there's great coverage of how excited the women in Boston were for her arrival, and she didn't get here. She canceled because she was pregnant and completely done in by morning sickness. And Stanton wrote a letter to one of her girlfriends in which she describes how she deliberately did not tell her Boston hosts why she had canceled. And here's what she wrote to her friend Elizabeth Miller Smith. This is a quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. "As the maternal difficulty has always been one of the arguments against women entering public life, I did not like the idea that I, who had 100 times declared that difficulty to be absurd, should illustrate in my own person the contrary thesis." Now, I end with this because I think in some ways, when the 19th century accounts, we have long ago repudiated. Right? Generations of feminists have made it impossible for us to accept any flat-footed account of either the maternal difficulty or really the feminine mystique as a satisfying explanation of gender at home and at work. So that's why the story of change from Elizabeth Cady Stanton to Betty Friedan to our own time is an extremely dramatic one, right? Not only in the law, but in many of the areas that Friedan, notably education, that Friedan pointed to as the problem. The hard question, I think, as I said at the beginning, is not how we tell the stories of change. Things look so different today than they did in 1963 in families and in workplaces that it's not hard to tell the story of change. I think the hard question is if we have moved beyond the maternal difficulty and we have moved beyond the feminine mystique, how do we account for the ways in which sex still seems to predict gender roles that leave mothers and fathers often differently situated at home and at work? And I'll just end with my own view that I think our challenge is really to push back on the ill-grounded logic that often supports men's and women's gendered roles at home and at work, and to really pick up where Stephanie left things off, which is to really make this a conversation about parents and people and not about mothers and women. I think our challenge, in other words, is really to make this a conversation that 50 years after Friedan is no longer in the feminine. So, thank you.
Thank you both. That was really stimulating. And building on what both of you have said, I wonder if you would address directly the question whether for women today, is there some parallel to the feminine mystique? It wouldn't be exactly the feminine mystique she described, certainly, but are there coalescences of discourses that tend to lead women in certain directions that may not be the most promising for them, or that constrain them in certain ways around these issues?
You want to start?
Sure.
Yeah, you have a mic here.
Well, I think that the old feminine mystique is practically gone. The old feminine mystique was the one that said girls do not even want to do the sort of thing that guys do, and if they did, they would be considered unattractive. They would not be able to find a man, and so that's why women will not do this. That old feminine mystique. I grew up with that feminine mystique. I can still remember my fifth grade teacher taking me aside and saying to me, Stephanie, if you wouldn't use such big words, the boys would like you better. Which was kind of traumatic because I thought they liked me fine, But how would I know? And a friend taken aside and said, don't throw the ball so hard. The boys won't like it. Well, that sort of mystique is gone. A colleague of mine at the Council on Contemporary Families, Barbara Rissman, has done a very big study of middle school girls and boys. And it is now just there's no trace of that. Girls feel perfectly fine about being as smart or smarter as the boys, of being really good at sports. The only place where you have a mystique that comes in and where they are really conscious in the way that my generation was made conscious all the time about that I'm a female and I have to behave in certain ways or I will be looked down upon, is what I call the haughty mystique. These girls feel perfectly free to be smart, to be strong, to be powerful, to be ambitious, to be competitive, but they also feel really pressed to look hot and to appear sexually, heterosexually available and interested. And it's a very powerful mystique. Most young women, especially if they go to college, do eventually grow out of it, but it still has very bad impulses, effects. We know that women who focus on that tend to have more eating disorders. They tend to have a lower sense of themselves as real actors in the world. And one of the several studies even show that when women are conscious of displaying themselves or being looked at in a sexual way, that it actually leads to less, it's the equivalent of like a 10 IQ drop during that period when they're interacting that way. So that's one mystique. The other one is the motherhood mystique, and you might want to talk, probably Ariela will want to talk about it more, but that's this idea that motherhood is so much more important than it was ever during the feminine mystique. During the ideal of the feminine mystique, the woman's job was to make herself wonderful for her husband, and that often meant palming off the dirty work of raising your kids on someone else, leaving them alone, telling them, oh, no, don't kiss me, don't touch me. I'm, as one of my informants for the books used to say, her mother used to say, oh, you don't even hug me, I'm all made up. And now, even though mothers spend more time with their kids than in 1965, working mothers spend less than homemaker moms, but they spend more time with their kids than homemaker moms did back in 1965, we are still assailed with this constant thing that you have to make every moment a teachable moment, that everything, every part of your child's development is anything you do as a mother, from whether you breastfeed to whether you co-sleep to whether you do this or you play this game, has these long-lasting effects upon your child. And it's just a real form of bullying, I think, in the same way that the old Freudian mystiques about women were, and very powerful and very hard. And it's one of the reasons that it's so hard to get out from under this idea that motherhood is a woman's job, because I know a lot of men who feel a lot of work-family conflict, but all you have to do to a working mother is to say, don't you feel guilty about leaving your mom? And most of us will say, I've been leaving your kids. Most of us have to struggle to feel confident about it. And so that is another very powerful mystique that we have.
So I agree with all of that. I'll just say a little bit more to elaborate on how I think the mystique, that type of message gets sent, often by extremely well-intentioned people. So let me say that. I think that's one of the interesting conundrums about how these messages get sent. So one thing to say is I think that it's harder to talk about a single women's mystique today. I think we are more conscious of the ways in which lots of different types of work situations and lots of different class questions and lots of different regional questions play out differently. That said, the phenomenon of women doing more childcare cuts across many of the things that divide other parts of this nation. Some of that is, I think, still the rational economic decisions that are made when women earn less on the dollar. But I do think that we convey not only that motherhood is precious and more important than everything else, but I think the message that home and work conflict is conveyed uniquely to women. No one ever told me not to use big words, but many people told me not to have a baby before I got tenure. Many well-intentioned people. Again, my husband and I went to college together. We went to law school together. We're like a little experiment. We clerked for the same federal judge. Nobody ever assumed, and I have surveyed many men on this, anecdotally. I'm not a social scientist. no one ever seemed to assume that my male peers' family goals were going to sit in conflict with their career goals. It just didn't occur to their mentors. Whereas the number of people who told me not to have a baby before I got tenure, there were a lot of them, and they meant well. It's just that it changes the way I think that young women entering jobs think about the possibility or impossibility of combining work and career in a way that's different. You know, it's not, Nancy alluded to an op-ed that I wrote about the way Mitt Romney talked about this to show my very rarely shown bipartisan credentials. I will say that Barack Obama spoke at the Barnard graduation a year and a half ago, and one of the things that President Obama said to the graduating class at Barnard was that they were going to face they as women were going to face the unique problem of balancing their careers and their home lives. And I really thought, you know, there is a well-intentioned person who has just messaged to some of the most likely to succeed women in our country that they have a problem that's all their own. And on the one, I think this is a really hard thing to figure out. I have this with my students all the time. On the one hand, it is going to be, right, statistically, women are going to do more childcare, and I want to be a good mentor, and I want to help them think about the ways to balance everything. And on the other hand, I do think that well-intentioned people continue to convey to men that work and family are compatible, and to women that work and family are incompatible.
Could I just add one sentence on it? Because one of the things that Friedan spent a lot of time doing was not only combating the kinds of prejudices that people had against women, but also the ones that women had internalized. And connected to that is something that sociologists call gatekeeping. The idea that we have grown up thinking that we are so responsible for childcare and the house, that we are the experts on it, and the guys can never do it right. So another smaller battle, I think it's secondary to the structural ones that we've been talking about, is that we need to combat that tendency in ourselves to think that, oh, we're the skilled person and we'll invite our husband in to help. But the way my own personal experience with this was the time that I was sneakily reloading the dishwasher that my husband had loaded, and he walked in and said, you know, if you do that, it's just so demoralizing that I'm happy never to load the dishwasher again. And I said, 2 more plates in versus him always loading the dishwasher, that's an easy choice to make. And we have to combat that one, too.
Well, that actually brings me to another question I wanted to ask, which was, how have pressures on men changed since Friedan wrote her book? She really didn't deal with men except as a model for what women should aspire to in terms of their ease of combining family and work. What about now?
Well, I think that a very good case can be made that there is a flip side of the feminine mystique, which told women that they should get all of their satisfactions and identity out of what they did at home, what they did through their family. The masculine mystique, of course, is that you get all your satisfactions and your identity out of what you do at work, your role as a breadwinner, your role as a protector and provider. And by the way, when I was doing the interviews for my new book on the feminine mystique and the women who read it at the time, I also talked to many men, and I came away thinking, gosh, in some ways, the ones who had the most disappointing experience with the masculine mystique were somehow had a worse time than the women in a certain way. The masculine mystique said, what feminine mystique said, look, as soon as you get your good provider, your 2 or 3 kids, you are going to be so happy and so fulfilled, and you never need anything else in your life. Well, if that happened and you weren't happy and fulfilled, and you could get past, as Friedan helped so many people to do, the idea that this was your problem, and could say, hey, I've been being told wrong. It wasn't too late to change your life. That's why the feminine mystique changed so many lives. But I talked to several men, and few of them actually ended up in tears when they talked about how, okay, the masculine mystique says you get all this reward when you retire. You get your pension, your gold watch, you come home to bask in the adoration of your family who you've supported so well. And turns out they came home to be strangers to their wives and children, and it was too late to do anything about it. I think that masculine mystique really persists today. One of the things that Rissman found in her studies is that although it's okay now on the part of both girls and boys for girls to engage in the kind of behaviors and have the same kind of aspirations that were traditionally associated with men, it is not okay for boys to have the same behaviors and interests and aspirations that were traditionally associated with females. They get bullied. You can think of all the kind of words they're done, and although women don't do the bullying, women often stand by and let it happen. So the masculine mystique is a real problem there. It's a problem in school. The other night I was debating Christina Hoff-Sommers, who argues that, boys are failing in school because the schools have all been feminized. No, boys are, the big problem boys have in schools is the masculine mystique that says it's girly to study. You don't want to achieve. That's a girl thing. And we see this throughout, throughout their lives, to the point that, for example, the masculine mystique makes it very hard for men to ask for the kinds of work-family accommodations that they increasingly want, and they get penalized for it that way. And so in this way, I think that there's so many ways that the masculine mystique is hurting men in the same, in different areas, but in the same kind of dynamics that it hurt women. Let me tell you one that I just found out. How even male privilege hurts men in some ways. One of the reasons that men drop out of college at higher rates than women do now is because of this pressure to be a breadwinner and not to take on as much debt. And the other thing about it is a male college dropout does not face the same financial penalty in starting salary as a female does. He gets the same, on average, the same starting salary as a college graduate. Whereas a female college dropout immediately has an average of $6,500 less a year starting salary. But of course, this initial male privilege is a huge burden over time, because a few years down the way, the college dropout male is earning less than either the male college graduate or the female college graduate. So there are many ways in which I do think we have this possibility, if we can get past the mystiques, get past the confusion in the law, get past the sort of things that say these are male and female issues, and of really pulling together a movement that works on behalf of all parents, all caregivers, all people who want to be well-rounded human beings.
So I agree with all that. And I will note, as a footnote, that all of the plaintiffs in the cases I were talking about were men. And I don't think that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she started litigating sex discrimination cases, deliberately chose male plaintiffs to challenge sex discrimination laws on the theory that it would be more sympathetic to the Supreme Court. I don't think that's why these plaintiffs were men. I think that these cases involve men in unusual caregiving roles. Hibbs himself was caring for his wife, not a child. But I do think that the flip of this is that often men who take untraditional parenting roles do face challenges socially and legally. I don't know if anyone saw the article in the New York Times about a lawsuit that a man is now bringing against Time Warner over their parental leave policy, which singles out biological dads and gives them extremely narrow parental leave. The flip to that, I think, and I think this is an area where there's probably vastly different social meaning to caregiving across different types of workplaces, and in particular, differences between elite workplaces and less elite workplaces. The flip of all of this, I think, is the credit that men get for the caregiving that they do. We have a daily newspaper watch in our house for which article describes which high-powered man as a really great dad for doing something miraculous like making breakfast or dropping off his kids at school or picking up his kids from school or, a class trip. And I do think that that is the sort of other side of this, which is that especially in settings like this, men get huge kudos for the type of routine caregiving care that goes unnoticed when women do it.
Thank you both. Just one other question, because I've been reflecting as you both speak on what I've thought about for some time as the really immense re-inscription of masculinity and femininity in mostly, I'm thinking in popular culture, advice, how-to books, that part of which is the address of the work-family problem only to women, but much of which also can be seen in the idea of the man cave, the extent of feminine decorativeness and the whole haughty mentality. And this is, I fear, an unanswerable question, but I wonder if either of you have thoughts on why a notion that moves toward androgyny seems so impossible for American culture to embrace. That is, I feel that in the 70s there was, under the pressure of feminist analysis and advocacy, there were a number of voices saying a more androgynous version of what humanity is could be beneficial to both men and women to break out of their ascribed sex roles. But that was very, very quickly pushed back. Part of this is merchandising, no question about that. But it does seem to be, why does the merchandising have the extent of take-up that it does? I don't know. Any thoughts?
Why don't you go first this time?
I think it might be the unanswerable question. Any thoughts? I don't know. I need to think about it a little bit. I mean, I think you're right. I'm not sure androgyny ever made it as far as it might feel like it has now. I mean, I guess when I think back at different cultural moments, there's always a way in which, I see the hottie phenomenon. I have a 10-year-old daughter, among other things, and see how early this stuff trickles down in cultural images. But I'm not sure we ever got as far towards getting rid of feminine and masculine markers. I think about this a lot in cases, again, the lawyer in me who thinks about these phenomena through cases, I think about this a lot in cases involving same-sex couples, where I think there's often a question about whether the traditional gendered roles that I'm describing fall apart in relationships where it's not biologically obvious who's going to play which role or don't. And I think that that's not an immediately obvious, there's no immediately obvious answer to that question either, in terms of how gender roles sometimes get reinscribed. But I don't have an answer to the cultural one. Do you?
I don't have an answer either, and I agree to some extent that it is a serious issue. For example, children's clothes and toys are much more gendered now, actually, than they've ever been in American history, not just since the 1970s. But there are other ways I think I would agree that the 1970s tiny minority of, we were out there who talked about androgyny, got a lot more publicity, when in fact there was much less support for it than there is now. I mean, I guess I'm kind of an optimist in terms of how much values have changed as opposed to how much structures have changed. Men's and women's values are clearly converging. Every Pew research does that men and women now both say that sharing household chores and sharing childcare is more important to a marriage. It ranks number 2, after, and it goes up every year. And you are seeing this huge rise in work-family conflict that young men are supporting precisely because are experiencing precisely because they do expect those, and many more women and men are finding it compatible. I think maybe what obviously these things move at different ways, and to the extent that there's actual androgynous behavior going on, you're going to get some people who find it threatening and maybe exaggerate their masculine or feminine behavior. So, we historians have to take the long route. It has been a very short social experience. Maybe to my students, 50 years seems like a long time, but to a historian, it's a pretty short time to change tapes that have been being played for 500 years.
Thanks. Well, you've been very patient, but now it's your chance to ask questions and make comments. So please do step up to that mic in the middle of the floor.
Hi, I have a quick question that really, I think, revolves around the question of the old economy versus the new economy. And it seems like for good reason, a lot of the statistics and a lot of the comparisons between what men and women are earning or their potential earnings are based particularly on sort of an old economic model, because that's where our figures come from. But if you think about something that's driving the new economy, a lot of it is the technology, a lot of it is venture capital, a lot of it is startups. There's the notion that, my father or mother had one job, I'll probably have 6 jobs, and my child will have 6 jobs at the same time. It's going to be a different economy, and there's the debate about whether college is still relevant to this economy and who's going to make the money, whether they go to college or not. So I guess I'd like to ask you to sort of look into the future, and when we think about venture capital and the fact that we know it's going much more to men, and it's being overseen much more by men, when we look at the IT sector, and we see women maybe coming into it but leaving it in droves, when we see the sciences still having that same pattern, and yet this is where the economy seems to be headed, away from the manufacturing, et cetera. I'd like you to maybe look into the future and think about what you know now and give us some sense of guidance about what you might see happening with men and women given these other factors.
Okay, well, as a historian, I hate always being asked questions about the future. I also hate it because I'm a longtime anti-war and civil rights activist and women's activist, and I think that futurists are not activists, and what we do in the future depends on what choices we make as a society and what choices we make as citizens to press our society. I mean, you talk about the new economy and the venture capitalists and stuff, and yes, many of the new really high-paying jobs in the tech economy have been going to men, although women have really increased their representation in the top 20-30% of the workforce. College degrees do count, especially from when they come from a high-prestige college, which is one of the reasons I think parents are feeling more and more pressure to spend all of this time grooming their kids for this increasingly competitive society. The place where college education doesn't count, of the 10 fastest growing jobs in America, all but 2 do not require a college degree. They're things like healthcare aides and janitors and home workers and low-wage retail workers. And they used to be, those women still are overrepresented in them, but as I said in my talk, men are dropping down. What we're really seeing is a hollowing out of middle-class occupations and middle-class routes to economic security. And the challenge to us is to, there are 3 challenges that I don't think have to be against each other, but must be done together. The one is the lean-in challenge. How do we get women, and I accept that's a real challenge. How do we get women to have the confidence to do these startup things, to compete in the fast-growing, well-paid sector of the economy? Another challenge is to men, to make them understand that the kind of old masculine occupations that used to be secure unionized jobs are no longer that, and maybe being a healthcare worker or taking on some of these jobs is an important way to protect themselves. But the biggest challenge of all is to get rid of this high-wage, low-wage job polarization. One of the real stunning paradoxes that we've seen is tremendous gains in support for personal equality, tremendous gains in tolerance for difference. You see it in the decline of racism, the decline of gender discrimination, the stunning increase in acceptability of same-sex marriage and gay and lesbian families. But it almost seems to be attached in a scary way to another form of libertarianism, and that is the idea that we don't take responsibility for social inequality, and we just let that slide. So I think the future depends upon what we do now to either let that happen or to stop it from happening. So the question is to you. What are you going to do?
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for your panel. Your answers and insight have been fascinating. I have one quick comment and then one question. I've been married 30 years, and I've often said it takes a confident man to deal with a successful woman. And I tell men that and women that, and I think we have to build up our men and tell them that they have to be confident to really support those of us who have made some choices to work and to do things that haven't been done before. So I encourage all of you to tell your men that they're confident and they're great and they're wonderful. But I am worried about Generation Y, and I thought you were going to get to it on the caveman hottie question. But this Gen Y issue really concerns me. Even at a top school, you see men, even in business school, and they're infantile. You know, they dress poorly when they go out. They, expect things to be handed to them hand and foot by these overbearing mothers that many of them have had and have spoiled them. And these young women are getting the degrees, learning things, still being a hottie. But how can you really get some of these bright men to grow up so that they will be confident men to support confident, strong women?
I think I have an easy answer to this one, but maybe I'll reflect a little bit on. I mean, I am amazed. I'm amazed by how hard it is to break certain gender patterns. So I teach big law school classes. I've stopped taking, law school, I teach in a sort of Socratic back and forth way. I've stopped taking volunteers. All the people, I call on people for the whole class. And that's because even with me at the front of the classroom in 2000 and whatever, if I take volunteers, the majority of volunteers come from white men. And it speaks, I think, to not all of them, not all the time, but it is disproportional enough, and it reproduces traditional sort of models enough that that I just don't take volunteers anymore. I do it all by calling on a broad group of people, which is easy in a law school class. Right, I bring this up just to say that I, too, am sobered by how hard it is to change certain traditional patterns. I don't know if there's. I don't know that I don't know that the kind of spoon-feeding entitlement you're describing, that I have seen that as particularly gendered as opposed to generational. But I too think the confidence message remains as, in my limited experience, remains as salient today as ever, and that kind of amazes me and speaks to the future question. I kind of agree. It's our responsibility to do the things it takes to break some of these, but I don't know if there are studies specifically on the gendered nature of the sort of spoon-feeding phenomenon that you're talking about, although it certainly is something that people talk about with the Generation Y question.
Well, I guess I'll be put on my optimist hat. I think that there's a lot of discussion, as you say, about whether, given the lengthening time period toward adulthood, it takes young people longer to develop responsibilities than it did to generations that went out earlier, because it's not a matter of biological or mental maturation, it's a matter of experience. So my son, who I am just totally proud of, 33, already has his own nonprofit teaching rural peasant women how to be frontline providers, and he's in his first year of residency. But man, 33, it took him till he was 30 to learn to hang his towel up, part of that's just that period where they don't live on their own, or they don't live in the kinds of settings that force that kind of maturity. So I'm less worried about that than some people are about the younger generation. I really do think that that as they move into maturity and into relationships, they are doing so much better than my generation and the generation before them. The men are doing 3 times as much childcare as they used to, not as much as women. But by the way, the work hours are even. In fact, aside from the early months of infancy, men actually work a total work week that is slightly longer than women, in contradistinction to the 1960s. The big problem are the structural ones that tend to force women back into the caregiving roles and pressure men into sustaining the breadwinning ones, I think.
I am the mother of a son who grew up and was brought up in a very non-traditional family, mostly a community of women, and he's 32, and I think he's doing very well for himself. But my question is, just in the period from the beginning of the feminine mystique to now, the nature of the family has changed considerably, and most of the examples I heard you use were heterosexual, monogamous, long-term relationship situations, and yet many of the children who are being raised at this point are being raised in various kinds of non-monogamous or non-heterosexual or non-long-term relationship families. And I wonder if you could talk about that. That's particularly true, I think, very often in poor families, in which children are raised by groups of women, often by grandparents, grandmothers. So I guess I didn't really hear you talk about that, how the nature of the family really has changed since the writing of the feminine mystique.
So I can say a little bit about that in terms of my own thinking. So one thing to say is this is someplace where the law is not the best. As a historian, legal sources are great in some ways and not great in other ways. And this is one of the ways in which the law is not always the best set of sources to look at because of calculations about what's a successful legal claim, which tend to lag behind social trends in all kinds of ways, in addition to the likelihood that your legal claim will be more successful if you make your family look like a traditional family, right? So, when I teach family law, one of the things I always talk about is the fact that if you read between the lines, these families are not as traditional as they're trying to appear to a court of law. Now, why are they trying to appear that way to a court of law? Well, generally, the best route to a set of rights is to make yourself look like a traditional structure that the law recognizes. I mean, in some sense, this is the big debate underlying the marriage equality movement as a social phenomenon. Right? Do you want to get a set of legal rights that require you to sort of paint yourself into a box that doesn't exactly match the non-normative ways in which you want to live your life, or not? So just a word on why my sources that I'm looking at might underrepresent that. I think you're right. I think families look dramatically different. And even within the law, in the 50 years since the feminine mystique, there have been multiple ways in which legislators and courts have recognized the extreme diversity of family formations in a way that really would have been, as a historian who thinks about the family, unimaginable just a short time before the feminine mystique. I guess I always struggle between, on the one hand, thinking that that the ways we've been talking do, in many ways, suggest that the landscape of families is more uniform than it really is, and thinking that there are important ways in which the dominant ways that these conversations unfold really affect people who are even living outside of the dominant form. So the assumptions that workplaces make about women and mothers, say, have a disparate effect, right? They impact negatively many women in the workplace. Women who want to become mothers and women who don't want to become mothers, women with male partners and women with female partners, women in monogamous relationships and women in non-monogamous relationships. So I struggle with this myself, and I think you're right to point it out, and I think we probably did fall into that, and I still think it's important to pay attention to the ways that dominant legal rules and dominant social conversations negatively impact negatively impact all forms of family and workplaces.
I'll just add very briefly. I spend a lot of my time actually talking about diverse families. That's my area, my fundamental area of expertise. And I think I heard a little bit about what does this mean for the kids. And I just want to emphasize that one of the important lessons of the last 50 years we've learned is that family processes are much more important than family structure. So that the tremendous turnover in families and the extent to which many single-parent families in impoverished communities are because of stresses of poverty, and those are obviously bad for kids. But a better predictor of how a kid will turn out is the mother's educational level and aspirations for her children. A better predictor than a two-parent family is how the family handles conflict. One of the fun things about looking at the evolution of same-sex marriage, I think that in many ways the demands for same-sex marriage, you know, the social conservatives say, oh my God, it's bringing an end to marriage as we've known it for 5,000 years. Actually, it's a result of the fact that heterosexuals brought to an end the way marriage has operated for 5,000 years. It was heterosexuals who demanded the right to marry for love, the right to sexual satisfaction, the right to contraception so you didn't have to have kids, the right to assisted reproduction, and it was heterosexuals in the 70s who turned over the laws that said that a man had to do one thing and the wife had to do another. And we have in this room one of the persons who's just spearheaded these wonderful explanations in all of the same-sex marriage suits about how the historical evolution of heterosexual marriage has paved the way for the rightness and acceptability of same-sex marriage. But when you get right there, one of the most exciting things to think about, and when we're looking at gender roles in the future, is how much these kind of families have to learn from each other. One of the big predictors of marital successful marriage among heterosexuals now is the amount of flexibilities they show in sexual division of labor. But heterosexual couples have very long-standing norms, including the gatekeeping, including the masculine mystique, and yet now we have same-sex couples being legalized all over who have much more flexible set of rules that people can learn from. So it's a very exciting time, I think, for us to maybe mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing about reflecting on where children are brought up, in what kinds of families, brings me to mention the statistic that many people are very surprised by, that actually the proportion of American families that contain a wife, a husband, and minor children under 18, it's only 18% of the American population. And so large a proportion of children in this country are actually being brought up in single-parent families by their mothers only, in the great majority of cases. And the emphasis that Ariela was making on how far the work-family balance question is landing on women certainly deeply impacts single mothers. It is being spoken to them, stressing their lives even more. And in addition to not bringing men into the picture in a more robust way, it doesn't bring other sorts of social structures that might make the lives of single parents easier, such as public daycare, public early childhood education, so that it's not only two-parent families that the constriction of this debate affects, certainly. Go ahead.
It's wonderful to be in a room with so many people who have also had their lives changed by this amazing book. But I want to continue the conversation about masculinities. It seems to me this is the edge where we have to push to understand the way change does and doesn't happen. Because I taught in the Institute for Gender and Development Studies in Trinidad at the University of West Indies for 4 years in the last 6 or 7 years. One of my students worked on women getting into one of the most masculine areas of the corporate world, which is corporate turnaround experts. It's an area where one executive I talked to said, there are no women there. Women are not, they don't belong there. They don't go there. Well, there are women there, but one of our students did an examination of the way did women coming into that masculine world change things. And what she discovered was that the women were valued for their technical capacity. They were given tons of work. They were worked very hard, but there was a way in which they were still seen as trying too hard to be like men, and so somehow like failed men and failed women. Whereas the men in these spaces were starting to take on a lot more nurturing role, and they were, instead of being seen as sort of trying to be women, they were seen as like special New Age men, the ideal managers. And so somehow in that now space with both women and men, the role of the gendered perceptions and reshaped themselves in ways that wound up with the men much more apt to be given the leadership positions, and women even questioning in that world, even questioning their own leadership capacity. And so the tenacity of and the role of gender in the distribution of resources, power, authority, and access to making important decisions in society still seem to me highly gendered, and the role of masculinities and femininities and the way masculinity maintains this tendency to be seen as the template for power. I wonder how, if either of you have thought about this in terms of your own work, because this is research done in 2010. This is not history, this is now.
I mean, I think that I think there are lots of interesting ways in which what you're speaking of, often puts women in a double bind at work. There's a classic sex discrimination case called Price Waterhouse against Hopkins, in which a woman named Ann Hopkins sued Price Waterhouse. And she sued after she was told to put on lipstick and dress more femininely and, walk a little differently and clean up her clothes. And part of what the case really points out is that for women in the workplace, you're often damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So if you look too much like a woman, you can't get ahead because it's a masculine norm. But if you look too much like a man, they wonder why you're not looking more like a woman. She won, she won on the kind of evidence that corporations don't put on the record anymore. But I do think what you're pointing to is real and points to really the difficulty. Again, I'm an optimist too, but I do think these norms are extremely hard to shift. And in the same ways that I think men are also penalized when they take on in the workplace certain feminized roles. I think that for women in particular, Kenji Yoshino, who teaches law, has written a book called Covering, in which he talks very poignantly about the sort of competing covering demands that are put on women in the workplace precisely because of this. So you're supposed to act like a man in certain ways, but you're also supposed to act like a woman in ways that might be counter to the sort of path to success.
And men cover too. I mean, when we do focus groups, we find that men are much more likely to tell other people at work that they have to leave early for a doctor appointment rather than it's their turn to pick up the kid. So they're very aware that there actually are stigmas still in most companies against men who really take advantage of work-family policies, and we have to work on this. The sort of field you're talking about is exactly the one actually Sheryl Sandberg is addressing in her book Lean In, which I know many people have disliked because it's very, very limited to one particular group of women. I actually think of it as having been written for the granddaughters of the women that Betty Friedan were talking to, the ones who have more education and more affluence and are now moving in but having to confront very different, that it's okay for them to work but still running into these entrenched gender roles. And I happen to think that it's a very well-researched book, much better than most of the gender books that have come out recently, and has some useful accounts of the kinds of male-female dynamics and gender dynamics, and some useful personal advice. But of course, a lot of it is structural, but we have to make it much more possible for women to act upon, for women and men both, to act upon their needs for family leave and again, what we find, the opposite of covering is that when you have laws that not only allow but take it as a norm that every parent will take time off, then women are much less discriminated against. Shelley Correll's research is showing that.
I mean, which points to the sort of uniqueness of America in the conversation that we're having. We really stand out in terms of our terrible legal protections for leave and for support for parents. Interesting. I was just reading a set of congressional debates about the possibility of paid maternity leave for women at the end of World War II. So there was a proposal to give paid maternity leave, which we still don't have. The federal government, in fact, has no paid leave for anyone right now. But one of the notable things, just from reading in the late 40s, is there's a whole appendix of every other country and their leave laws. And already in the late 40s, we are just a huge outlier on the international scene, and we have remained so. And I think that is unquestionably part of the story.
Let me just add one sentence to that, though, because although I'm a firm believer, and it is just amazing how far behind we are. There are many countries that have very generous paid maternity leaves for women, and it results in discrimination against women. The companies don't want to hire them, so you've got to have the men in this from the beginning. That if it is not something that men also do, then it's going to work against women in a different way.
I want to thank you very much for this stimulating conversation and the historic perspectives you bring. It's fascinating, and I just wanted to tell a quick story. I was very good friends with Betty Friedan. I was the director of a research institute in the late 80s, and she came and joined the institute, and she was notoriously difficult. But the reason that we became friends is that my husband, who was a lovely man, was a comedy writer. I came home one day ranting and raving about how difficult it was to have Betty, and she had already been kicked out of 2 other institutions, and we were stuck with her, and why did I have to have her? And he just looked at me, and he said, if Martin Luther King were alive, you would make it work. He said, Martin Luther King is dead, but Betty Friedan is alive. And then he said to me, treat her like your grandmother. And she wasn't that much older than me. She was about a generation older. But that is what I did. And we ended up being very good friends. I traveled to Iceland with her. We traveled to Europe together. And we really became friends. And in the 90s, when I started a girls' school, something that she was against because girls should get in the best boys' schools, we shouldn't separate them out, she nevertheless wrote a blurb for my book advocating single-sex education. And she invited me to come out. She was to join a club that previously had not had any women, a club in Washington, D.C., where she was then living, and I think it was the Copernicus Club. At any rate, it was this occasion, and she invited me to come out and be on a panel like this, and she spoke to a group of people that were a lot of men, largely men. And she made a presentation, and I was supposed to handle the questions after. And Betty Friedan was difficult, that's been established, but she was also a kick. And she was very warm, and she was funny. And there were a couple of different questions about her book and what did it mean for men, and there were a lot of men in the group. Then there was a question from a boy. There was one 12-year-old boy who was in the audience with his father, I assume. And he said, Ms. Friedan, because of your book and because of your work and Title IX, and things have changed, and I am a boy who is a pretty good athlete, and I should be able to play on a team. But because of what you've done, and because of the law being changed and everything, it's now only the best boys who get to play sports, and then the best girls get the other team. And there was just real quiet. And Betty Friedan leaned out and looked at him, and she said, "Tough."
I assume that doesn't require a response. I want to thank Radcliffe, too, for sponsoring this. I teach American intellectual history, and my students are reading an excerpt from Feminine Mystique for next Thursday, so this is very timely for me. They're also reading something by Judith Butler, and I'm not going to ask you about Judith Butler, but they're also reading something from Joan Williams, another law professor. Yeah. And part of her portfolio, in addition to writing, is to run an organization called Work-Life Law that tries to pressure places of work to change their rules for men and women. And I wondered if you would comment about that strategy for changing some of the stereotypes that we still have to feel encumbered by.
I mean, so I agree 100% with what Stephanie said at the end of the last comment, which is that, you know, until these rules are equalized for men and women, it's sort of hopeless. I think that maternity-only leave policies, you know, reinforce this very set of ideas. So I think it's key to get workplaces to adopt rules that not only have equal parental leave for men and women, but that think about how to incentivize men and women to take it equally, and then to use it for caregiving. I mean, this is obviously, we're in the academy. I think that this is something universities have struggled with, but not hard enough. I think that you need not only policies that are equal on the books, but you need workplaces that think about changing culture. I think Joan Williams' work is fantastic on this, that think about changing cultures so that men and women both take leave, and then especially in settings like the academy, where she is and where we are sitting now, then men take leave and actually use it to be with their children, as opposed to writing a book or pursuing other projects. But I think that pressuring workplaces to adopt leave provisions and flex time provisions, and then thinking about how, look, I mean, what I didn't talk about in my remarks is the complicated relationship between legal rules and social norms. I don't think that there's a quick legal rule fix or a quick policy fix to these social norms. You know, and comparative work across different countries, I think, has reinforced that. There's no one policy that's just going to fix this. But I think that workplace policies matter, and I think workplace cultures matter, and I think that policy and culture ideally go hand in hand if processes of change are well done.
Well, all right, we'll have one more question, and then we'll conclude.
I appreciate that. I wondered, in the realm of family law, if you feel that the advances in domestic violence law have also created a bias within making family life maybe skewed towards mothers only, raising children, or in any way has made a difference in some biases towards family life?
I mean, I think that domestic violence law in particular, meaning states where if you are proven to have been
if you saw any biases in family law as it exists that perhaps tip judgments of sharing family life towards the female versus the male, and if there's any changes that you've seen in your research or your studies that have indicated that we need to look more upon that?
I mean, I think mothers are still more likely statistically to get custody. I think that has changed in dramatic ways from times when the law had legal rules that gave mothers presumptions for custody. These are complicated questions. States, I mean, I think I don't know if that's the area you're thinking of, but that's certainly a main area.
I don't mean to say domestic violence exclusively, but the family laws that exist in general.
I mean, look, these are complicated questions. In many areas of parental rights and responsibilities, there's a relationship between the way you have parented and how much you have parented and what rights or custody arrangement you get thereafter. And there certainly is a growing fathers' rights movement that has accused the law of being overly biased towards mothers, in some of the ways that I think you're alluding to.
Right.
I mean, this is another, without going too far, this is another area where I think the last 50 years has just been a dramatic time of change in which legal rules have really aimed towards thinking about parents as parents. It's also an area where legal doctrine kind of doesn't get you there because it's all about amorphous standards applied by way too many judges, many of which never even get to courts because families work it out. So I think we are here very much in a progress of a story of change that's evolving, in which, as with the other stories, there is some lingering continuity.
I'll just add that we need, just as we have with families, to take a more nuanced approach to the differences in these. Michael P. Johnson talks about the difference between common couple violence and intimate terrorism, which is almost always done by men and which almost always requires them being gotten out of there. But there are ways to work with common culture violence that we are just beginning to learn. Mandatory arrests seem to work very well for white middle-class guys who are battering. They do not work well in low-income and especially minority communities, where arrest is more common anyway. So this is the sort of thing that you start by identifying a problem and applying a solution to it whole scale that helps, but that may help rescue some people from really bad situations, but may also not take into account individual variations and therefore result in injustices. And we're just beginning to get the data in about more nuanced tools for dealing with this.
New York had a policy some years back of removing kids from their homes if the mother was herself a victim of domestic abuse, because that was seen as her not having protected her children sufficiently. And so women who were victims of domestic abuse were likewise losing their children for failure to protect them from an abusive environment. And that was challenged, and the policy was struck down by a federal court. But it speaks to sort of the complicated ways in which, policies that make sense in some ways when you think about violence end up not necessarily serving the interests that you were thinking of.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. And as we're concluding, I just want to mention, this won't be possible today because the library is closed, but for those of you who are in the area, there is a wonderful exhibit in the Schlesinger Library of Betty Friedan's papers, particularly focusing on her writing of the feminine mystique, showing the early drafts, early articles she submitted, responses she got from the magazine articles she first wrote before the book. It's quite a fascinating tour, so I urge you to come take a look. It'll be in the library for another few months. And please join me in thanking our panelists.